Good morning, Malia. How are things? I'll say it again. I think you didn't catch me. Good morning, Malia. How are things? Good morning. How are things, Liana?
They're going well. How are you?
Things are going good. Malia can't see me or hear me. I'm not sure what's wrong. But the fact you got through must mean things are okay.
Yeah.
So how's your job going? Enjoying it?
Me?
Yes.
No. Definitely
You're not
not.
enjoying it? Oh dear, that's not
No,
good.
it's too chaotic. There's no rhyme or reason. Everybody's quitting.
Oh,
It's not fun to be there anymore.
oh, that's
Like, I make the most of it while I'm there, but I don't want to be there anymore. Just because of that situation.
so. Is that a hospital you're working in, or is
Yeah,
it
the hospital.
Yeah. It's not a VA one. It's just a hospital.
Nope, just regular hospital. The only hospital on the peninsula.
Yeah. That's sad. I think since you spend a lot of your waking life in your job, it's should be quite high up on the list that you enjoy what you do.
Like, I used to enjoy it, and like I enjoy the people that I work with, but I think it's just like we have no staff right now. Management is a hot mess right now. Like,
Too much stress. That's
yeah,
what it sounds like.
Like, it's way too much stress for what it's worth, and everybody's mad. That's a patient that's there, so it's just like, I don't know. Like, they're mad that they have to wait, which I understand, but at the same time, like, I can't control the wait time either. So I really don't know what you want me to tell you. And then, like, people are cussing me out because I'm just trying to do my job. So it's just, the stress is being felt from everywhere, and I just don't.
I can understand people being annoyed at waiting, but maybe it's just my personality. I don't think I'm quick going through my brain. I don't think I've ever been rude to anyone in a hospital, or a waitress or a taxi driver or anybody. I mean,
Oh yeah.
they're just trying to.
Oh, I've been cussed
Why?
out more times lately than I have for like just trying to do my job. People like mad they have to wait, and I'm like, I understand you're upset that you have to wait, but you're not dying either. Like, you came to the emergency room for a non-emergent problem. And
Yeah,
then you have to explain it to them, like, you're not getting pulled back first. That's a good thing because you're not dying.
Yeah.
But when I disappear for a long time for somebody who's actually dying, Like, I'm sorry, your blanket that you needed is not that important right now if they can't breathe. And I'm trying to make them breathe. So, having to like put things in perspective for people.
Whoa, that was a good one. That got me waking up.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I probably need it. I've been tired today. I'm getting tired
Both
every
my
day.
dogs were laying in here. I think a mailman just showed up. So like I heard the car and they're like,
Oh, yeah. Hi, how are you? Yeah. Well, I think it's difficult in the hospitals in general because if people who don't need to be in the emergency ward, are they just going there because they don't have insurance and they don't want to pay for a doctor to see them?
no. So all the urgent cares in the area, get out. You too. All the urgent cares in the area close at like 6. So if you have any kind of problem after 6, the doctor's offices are closed and all the urgent cares are closed. So like the only place to come is the ER. But like there's certain things I'm like, yes, 100% an emergent. Like you like cut your arm open, probably emergency. You know, like come get stitches. But if you were coming in for back pain that you've had for 20 years, as all of a sudden like worse today, I'm like, hold on. Like, let's put this in perspective. Like, this has been happening for 20 years. What is so different today, right now, that is so emergent that you need to be seen today? They like want you to fix. They want you to fix them, and I'm like, this isn't a fix. Like, if you've been having this for 20 years, we're not just gonna miraculously fix you today.
You sound like my wife. Not what you're doing, but my wife does this, and it's good therapeutic. She likes to have a good mump in her groin because once she gets over with it, it makes her feel better. So you sound like I'm having a really hard time. So I'm going to tell you about the really hard time I'm having, and once I get it out of my system, I just find I feel better. So it's good. It's good to vent. It's healthy. Yeah. It's a good thing to do. You can't really do it to your nurse friends because they're going through the same thing.
Oh yeah,
and they're
probably we all do it together. Like we'll all
why? Yeah, we just mutually vent. Okay, yeah, that works.
Yeah.
What about you, Brandon? Are you a venter when things bug you? Do you go and tell your poor wife about it and just get it out and that you feel better?
Oh yeah, she hates whenever I'm venting about stuff. Usually it's I'll be working on the house, and this house was built in like 1920.
Oh dear.
So it's one of the things where like I built houses for 8 years before I worked in Agri for another 8. So I'm used to like working on projects and stuff like that. But with these really old houses, you look at something and you're like maybe 2,000 max. I'll make it 2,500 to do the repair just to give me some wiggle room. And then you open it up and there's just like rot behind it and stuff. And you're like, well, that just went up by another $2,000, $3,000. And they had blackberries that took over the whole yard. So we've been like, I'm talking 7 feet tall and 2-inch wide, stemmed, aggressive. They took over the whole yard. So we've been battling those. I've been hacking those down like a fiend, trying to keep it down to just dirt until the fall so that I can get a chance to kill all the rhizomes off. But yeah, she gets the brunt of me out there yelling about stuff like another thing.
But I don't have that in the backyard. We have a corner in our backyard because our corner meets, so there's 4 houses right in that corner. And the house to the right of us has a bloody big blackberry, whatever it is, bush. And of course, those things don't stay in their own yard. So I can only kill what I can kill. You're not allowed to jump into your neighbour's yard and hack away at their stuff because they frown upon it. And yeah, so I do feel your pain. So, but that's an ongoing job. To be honest, it's a guy that does it for me now because of my health issues. But when I used to do it, you would do it, and then 3 months later, the buggers had already climbed back in. I mean, you were never getting rid of the problem. You were only kind of subduing it, and that's frustrating. And to this day, that bloody bush is still in my next door neighbour's yard.
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of you know, being super organic and everything whenever I can be, but when it comes to blackberries, the only way to kill them is you get them down to the dirt and then you just hose it a couple of times and then let the rain wash out the poison over the fall.
Yeah.
But you have, because the rhizomes are just so hardy that if there's anything left, even you can't even compost them, because if you throw them in the composting
They'll
pile,
start
one,
growing there.
the thorns don't break down. So
Oh.
if the rest of it manages to break down, your dirt has a bunch of thorns in it, but they'll just start growing out of your compost pile.
Yeah, I get
Little
it.
chunk like that that's still green.
Well, one of the problems we have with our next door neighbour is it's not the same next door neighbour. That house in particular, the other three are owned, but that's a renter, and I don't think I've met the owner. And you can't really talk to a renter and say, "Well, can you kill all that?" You know, it's not my job to kill off bushes, right? So,
Just go spray a little bush killer.
oh, you mean accidentally overshoot the spray?
Whoops! Drop
Oops.
the cup of it over there.
Like 20 feet of it, because that's how big the bloody thing is. Yeah. Or I could just accidentally ask you to come down and accidentally mistake which house I lived in, and you cleared out the other one by mistake. That could happen, because I ain't doing it. But it sounds like you're a professional, so you probably could do it. You've had lots of practice.
I'm pretty convinced that the only way to get rid of Himalayan blackberries is probably some kind of bioweapon.
I know one of those flamethrowers that you can buy, or used to be able to buy. I think they would be pretty effective. You just burn the buggers. Probably dangerous, but that would work. Hi, Rosie. I can't see you. What's up?
Just reading my emails.
Okay. Well, I think we're probably, for the most part, the tongue in. Yep, you're good. You're here. Who else? Maya, you're good. Okay, let's get started. We've got two different jobs to do today. And the first half of today, or whatever time it takes, is we're going to go into one last time the issue of collecting data and the problems that you get that are associated with that data collection. I think the first step in statistics is to collect good data. And most of the time, the questions we've done, that data has already been collected, and we make the assumption that it's good data, right? It's going to give us good results. And I'm probably paraphrasing this, but isn't there a computer term, garbage in, garbage out? Right. So if you start with bad data, you can do the best, cleanest statistical analysis, but won't your conclusion be useless because the data you started with was corrupted in some way. And we call that biasness. So I'm going to go through a number of the different situations about how that's a problem and talk about examples of each of these and how we try and counteract it. And we're also going to look a little bit more in detail, and we have before, but this is like for one last time. We're going to look at the two major ways in which we look at situations, and that is we have observational studies and experimental design. What are different about them and what's good and bad about them. So let's look at our first problem. So there's going to be a lot of listening because I'm not going to write this down. Let's start off with, you want to collect unbiased data. How is that good? Well, you want good data, good conclusions. Bad data, bad conclusions. The general term we use is biased when there's something wrong with the data. That means it's not a fair representation of the population. And there are lots of kinds of bias, but here's some of them. So let's suppose that you go out and you're collecting data and it's very sensitive, for instance. One of the problems you can get collecting data is, couldn't the people you ask tell you a lie? Now, if it's very sensitive data, that is a big problem. Right? Now, if it's a question like how many children in your family, the amount of lying that you get there is probably negligible, right? People are not going to be particularly likely to tell you a lie, and things like that. But let's give you a scenario. Suppose I wanted to collect data from high schools on the types of drugs that the high school students are using, at least the ones that are using drugs. If I went to that high school with a forum where we listed the major drugs that we know students take and asked them to check off which ones they've used in the last month, right? That kind of survey, right? Collecting of the data. If we just went to the school and handed them out in front of the students and asked them to fill them in, can you imagine the amount of lying you're going to get out of that? They are not going to tell you the truth, right? Oh yeah, if I write down I'm taking this, you're going to see it's me, I'm going to get into trouble, ain't going to happen. If you, for instance, in a different scenario, if you're asking people their political views, in some places, could you imagine that if you were a MAGA supporter, that you might find it very difficult to answer that question, because in some places at least, wouldn't you get a really rough time if you had that political viewpoint? And so people will lie about their politics, especially if it was done in a context where you feel it wasn't secret, right? You felt that were people going to find out about it. So people tend to lie for all sorts of reasons. You can get around that problem. For instance, if you went and asked a whole load of male, married men, have they ever been unfaithful to their wife, right? That would be another big respondent lie situation. So how do we get around them? Let's return to the first scenario. High school students taking drugs. If you wanted to find good data for that, one way you could do it is to take each student separately and put them in an office, and there's a box there with a slit in it, and you hand them the piece of paper, and you tell them that you're going to fill this data in. Once you're finished, you're just going to fold it up and stick it in that box. And there's already 50 or 60 other people's answers. Your name is not on this piece of paper. And the reason we want to collect this data is we want to find out what kind of drugs high school students are doing, because if someone overdoses, it's very helpful for the medical profession to know what's the most likely drug that they might be overdosing on, and that could save lives. So if you tell them why you're going to do it, and you show them that there's a lot of anonymity in it, you can get much better response rates that are not lies. That seems reasonable. If you can try and set it up in I feel safe, I feel anonymous, I know why you're collecting it, you're much more likely to do that. You can even do it in the other situations as well. Now, number 2 is called non-response bias. If you send out a questionnaire to 100 people and 60 of them don't bother to answer, so basically you're only getting data from 40% of the people, can you see why that might cause bias in your results? Because the 60 who didn't answer your questionnaire could be important, right? Their views. Let's suppose you were talking about political parties again, right? And people who have one particular political view might just say, it's none of your bloody business who I'm going to vote for. I'm not going to tell you, right? So they don't answer it. And if they happen to be a lot of Democrats, can you see that you'd underestimate the Democrats? Or if they happen to be conservatives, you'd underestimate the Republicans, right? And so non-response bias can be a problem. There are some ways in which you can reduce it, but in some cases it's quite hard. One way, and I've had this, I don't know if any of you have had it. They sent me a questionnaire and they sent me a $1 bill. You ever had that? And I kind of felt obliged to fill it in because they gave me money, because I kind of felt guilty that I was going to keep it, what would do a dollar, but it was money, right? So that was one way of getting the non-response bias down. Pay people money to do it. And money is very influential. It can make people do things that they might not do, if it's too much work. You can also reduce non-response bias by making it a very simple to answer question or two, right? People might answer 2 or 3 questions, right? Boom. But if it's a 40-page booklet with 200 questions, can you imagine how many non-responses you're going to get out of that? I'm not going to spend an hour doing that. What the point, right? So keep the questions small can reduce that. Very often it's helpful if you tell people why you're collecting the data. And good came into my head, so I'm going to tell you a little story about my mum. She's passed away now, but my mum was towards the end of when she was in her 90s, her hearing was not very good, but my mum was really polite. So she picked up the phone, and it was one of those telemarketers, the people who want to sell you windows or doors or something, right? And she picked up the phone, and all we could hear my mum was saying, yeah, yeah. She would do that. And then when they got to about the end of the 10-minute, selling spree, my mum went and said to the guy, I never heard a word you said. Could you tell me it again? And the guy put the phone down. And I thought, what a cool way of doing it. Because, they always phone at dinner time, don't they? When you're busy, these people. So I was thinking, I've never done it yet, that if it ever happens to me, I'm going to keep the phone and I'm going to keep eating my dinner and occasionally say, right? And then, now just keep eating my dinner. And then after the whatever 10-minute spiel, I'm going to say, I never heard a word you said. Do you want to tell me again? And see if that would get the same effect. I don't know if I'll ever do that, but I feel that would be a cool thing to do. Aidan, would that be a cool thing to do? Yeah. Okay.
So non-response bias, does that, and it probably is one of the other ones, but does that cover if someone doesn't respond, like let's say you send out a survey on healthy habits,
right?
And the people that respond
are probably healthy.
And the ones that
don't are unhealthy.
Are probably just not going to send it in at all.
Yeah, that's the problem with non-response bias. The people who don't respond might be significantly different from those who do respond, right? I mean, for instance, if you did a questionnaire about finding out people's, what is it, community responsibility, like people who want to, help the community. You can imagine the people responding to that are the ones who like to help the community, and the people who don't respond to that are the ones who don't want to help the community, right? So that would be another example of that same situation. So non-response bias are people who don't answer, right? And you can get away with 2 or 3%. That's probably not going to kill you, right? But if it's anything more than about 3 or 4, you should be really worried about it. There are workarounds. What you can then do is you can go back to the people who didn't respond and in some other way get them to respond. And if they end up being pretty much like the other group of people, then it doesn't matter. But if they end up being significantly different, then you got to figure out how to, tweak your data to take that into account. Third type of problem is the question is asked in a biased way. And one of the things you have to be careful about if you're creating a questionnaire, right, if you're collecting data, is you have a standard question, right? You don't let the person who's doing it just decide to ask it any old way, right? Because that would distort your data, because the way you would ask the question might be different than Aidan, right? Because you'll get 20 people collecting the data, right? So you tell them this is a sentence you will use when you ask them the question. But that's not always just good enough, because if there is power words inside the sentence, and power words are just words that have a kind of emotional response. And to give you an example, suppose you were interested in capital punishment, right? That people could be killed, right, for murders, right? Hanged or electric chair, whatever method they use, gas, I think they can sometimes use. If you say, are you in favor of people being executed? are you in favor of people being killed? Right? Those two words have different meanings. Doesn't the word executed in some way imply that there's a process behind it and it's legal? And doesn't the word killed seem like there's no process and you're just killing someone? You see, that would be an example of just that one word would have a different emphasis on your question. Are you in favor of killing an unborn child? Or are you in favor of a woman's right to choose? Now, they're both asking you about abortion, agreed? But they're definitely asking you in a biased way in both cases, right? And if you are definitely for abortion or definitely against, even if I phrased it in a biased way, it's probably not going to influence your answer, right? But if you're a kind of middle of the road, you're kind of, I'm not sure one way or the other, you're not undecided. Couldn't the way that question be phrased influence your results? And so biased questions are a bad idea, but they do happen, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes deliberately, right? They're asking a biased question because they want a certain answer, so that the politician can then go and say 80% of the people are in favor of whatever it is. Make up some numbers for you. 80% of the tax-paying population are in favor of getting free stuff. 80% of the tax-paying population are against paying for other people to get free stuff. And that question basically going to be, are you in favor of a tax or not, right? But you can phrase it in one way and get a response, and that you can see what's going to happen then. Can't you see that both political groups will say, look, 90% or 80% are in favor of what I just said, and then the other group says, no, 80 or 90% are in favor of a totally opposite thing from what you just said, right? And you're really cross purposes. Bias questions should keep away from power words, right? Any word like kill, murder, right? Those types of words, definitely power words, right? Keep away from them and keep your sentence small is also helpful.
So I know it would fluctuate, and you can't necessarily make the perfect question, but with question bias, does it cover kind of the social bias? Like if you're being asked something very sensitive by the man out in front of Walmart because your community members are around you, your answer might be different because you see that question as something that other people could judge you for.
Right. I mean, that could come under number one, respondents lie, because wouldn't you probably answer the way that your friends would like, you want to be liked, so you would answer it whatever the answer that would make them like you, right? So if a lot of your friends are in favor of saving the world and hugging the trees or whatever, right? And then you get asked a question, are you in favor of solar power and removing fossil fuels? Even although you aren't, you might quite easily say yes, because your friends are around, right? Those types of things are very, very helpful. You should try when you collect data to try and do it on a one-to-one basis with as little outside influences going on if you want the best data. Now, this one here sounds like the same, but what I'm getting at in this one is the person who is asking the question, because very often a lot of these are people asking you the question, right? They have a little clipboard, they read the sentence out and then you answer it and they check it off, and that's how they get their data. The questionnaire themselves can actually bias the answer. If you're doing a questionnaire about let's think. Right, you're doing a questionnaire about, I think I've used this one before. and it's a guy being asked, and you're asking them what feature of a girl you're most attractive to, right? And you would say, well, her personality, her sense of humor, you know, her body or some part of her body, right? Her eyes or whatever it is, right? You've got a list of things you could do. If it's a guy talking to a guy, you would get one response. If it was the questionnaire was a pretty girl and you were asking the same guy, can you see that that questionnaire will maybe change the answer you would give? Maybe you like that girl and you want her to like you, so you're not going to be very superficial, and you're going to say, oh, it's her personality or it's her eyes or something, right? Rather than what you might have said if it was a dude with another dude, right? So the person who's asking, if the person who's asking the question is of a certain ethnicity, and that question you're asking is something to do with race, can you imagine that might influence your answer? So the person who's asking the question, and that's one you might not even think. Now, it doesn't matter if I'm asking you things like, how many times do you go to a doctor in a month, right? I don't think if it's a girl, a boy, a Scotsman, an old, a young, I don't think that's going to change your answer, right? So it's not a problem that's going to be universal, but can you imagine in some circumstances that could be an issue? Now, sample bias is who you ask. If I am interested in a question, for instance, about, let's say, politics, and I decide that I'm going to only ask people by telephoning them, and telephone surveys are some of the cheapest ways to talk to a lot of people, so you can get a big sample, because right, you don't need to wait there and somebody comes by and then you ask them and all that stuff. You can just phone them up, and if they answer, that's great. But phoning isn't necessarily a very good way of getting data. I'll give you an example. Suppose you're interested in how wealthy people are, right? How rich they are, and somehow or other you've got a way to get them to tell you the truth. So number one might kick in, right? But let's suppose you get by that. If you only phone people, aren't you not going to be able to talk to people who don't have a phone? And it would be reasonable to assume that the poorest people are the ones who don't have phones. So can you see that your data is going to be biased because you're not getting a good representation of the population? Because of the way you're collecting the data, you're missing out a certain subgroup of people, right? That would be an example of a sample bias. Another example of sample bias might be to go to the mall at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday and just ask everybody that is going by, whatever it is. Now, why is that a problem? Well, at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, isn't there a really good chance that you're not going to talk to people who have jobs, or at least daytime jobs? Because they're not going to be at the mall at 2 o'clock, right? They're going to be at school. They're going to be, a policeman doing his job. They're going to be working, right? And so that sample would be a bias because the people you're asking are not a fair representation of the population at large. Sample size is a pretty easy one. Don't ask 2 people and expect to get a decent result, right? The going rate for decent samples is surprisingly large. It's about 1,000 and change, about 1,004, 6, 8. So if you ever see one in television and they're talking about, the latest poll on President Biden's popularity or whatever it is, right, that kind of thing, you're going to find, that plus or minus that you get, the margin of error. Most of those samples are about 1,000 and change. They tend to be done by professional companies like Gallup Poll or Quinnipiac, and there's a couple of others I can't think of at the top of my head. So since 1,000 is a going rate, you can do a sample of 100, right? And it will theoretically work. You could maybe do a sample of 30 and it might work, but shouldn't you be really worried about any conclusions on a small sample size? Because the smaller it is, isn't it more likely you just got a weird group of people and it's not a representative group? Under coverage. If you are interested in the opinions of a lot of people, and there's a small subgroup of people compared to the entire population. So let's just say 1 in 100 people in America are Scottish, just for argument's sake. If you're only going to ask 1,000 people, aren't the chances that you get a lot of Scots people quite small? You probably only get, now, the way things work is that most of the time that's going to be okay. But couldn't there be some situations where you just got bad luck and almost met no Scotsman? And if Scotsmen are very specific, in other words, they all tend to vote the same way, could it not be a problem if you miss subgroups of people? So we know from experience that older people tend to be more conservative and younger people tend to be more liberal, right? So Republicans tend to be older, right? Democrat voters tend to be younger. Males tend to be more Republican, females tend to be more Democrat. And certain ethnic minorities tend to be more Democrat, white Caucasian people tend to be more Republican, right? We know all these subgroups. Now, most of them are pretty big chunks of people, right? But there's all sorts of small subgroups that have very, very strong political views. In other words, a large proportion of them tend to vote one way rather than the other. Right? And so if you have an undercoverage, it just means that fewer than you should are in your sample, right? And that can cause problems if they tend to be one more than the other. Any other situations you want to know about biases? You happy with these, or are there some questions you might want to ask before I move on?
I did have a sample bias story from school. It was after the 2008 recession. The news ran our local news ran an article on a questionnaire that they ran on how people were doing, whether they'd lost their jobs, how financially they're holding up. And it said that everybody was pretty much doing fine. And it turned out that they had gone to the Creek and Valhalla communities, which are all like the millionaires and white collar jobs and stuff like that.
Yeah. So if you want a certain answer, won't you actually deliberately do that? I mean, if you want to publicize how rich Washington State is, couldn't you go to Poolsbo? Or Bainbridge Island, probably a better choice, right? Couldn't you just go to Bainbridge Island and ask everybody there about what's the price of your house and how much do you make a year and how much you got in the bank? And if you only use that as your sample, couldn't you come back and say, hey, Washington State's loaded. We are a really rich country, state.
You could find 1,000 people with waterfront property around Lake Washington or something pretty easily,
Right, that would be it. In the same vein, couldn't you then find places that are very poor areas? Because America tends to be in regions where all the rich are here, and then it only needs to be like half a mile or less, and then there's another region where a lot of rich people live, right? So it's not like they're miles apart. And it wouldn't be too difficult if you were unscrupulous, wouldn't it be, to choose an area that you know has got a higher proportion of certain people that you're interested in picking, and get your answers that way. So yeah, I tend to almost exclusively ignore every politician's poll, right? So when you know it's being paid for by the Democrat or the Republican Party, just ignore it. That's the safest bet. There's just too much, for want of a better word, cheating going on in the way they do things. Right? Also, if you can, and it's not politics, but if it's anything, if the Banana Company of America sponsored a poll that showed people who eat bananas live 5 years longer than people who don't, would you agree that there's probably a lot of skepticism in that poll? So have you ever, you get it almost every month, don't you get people who drink coffee, blah, 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 good thing. And then 2 weeks later, people who drink coffee, blah, 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 high blood pressure, right? Bad thing. Right? If you look at the first one, it's probably a coffee company that paid for it. And if you look at the second thing, it's probably the milk company or somebody who doesn't want you to drink coffee paid for it. So keep away from those. They're not very accurate. You know, I don't like governments, but actually government organizations typically produce really good data. So that sounds, if you know what I'm like, not liking governments, the fact that I can say that is quite interesting. But they do, they tend to, now what the politicians then do is they interpret that data the way they want, but the data itself is good. I've not really seen much in the way of that being doctored. Well, let's look at types of observational studies. This is part of collecting the data. And there are 3 kinds of observational studies. Now, what makes an observational study is that the people that you choose, and there's typically going to be 2 groups, right? The people who do something you're interested in and the people who don't, right? So the people who smoke cigarettes and the people who don't, and you're interested in their health, right? That's an observational study. Those 2 groups, you do not pick who goes in them. That's the key to an observational study, right? Smokers choose to smoke, non-smokers choose to not smoke. That makes it observational. And there are 3 main kinds. There's a retrospective study, and that's where you look at data from the past. Story. Suppose doctors are beginning to notice a larger number of leukemia cases than there has been in the past. And so just through word of mouth, hospitals are saying, look, we're getting a lot more, leukemia treatment cases. And people start wondering, is there some reason for that? Right? So what they would do maybe is get a retrospective study. And so you might go back and you would collect data from the doctors. Everything is stored somewhere, right? And you find out how many leukemia cases there were in 1960, 1961, 1962, and so on. You look at the past. And if you notice that there is an increase, in other words, more people are catching it, percentage of the population, because the population is growing. And because the population is growing, won't everything increase by the rate of growth, right? So you're looking at a percentage. And typically, it's like how many per 100,000 people, right? So how many per 100,000 have leukemia? And if you notice that that is going up, then that is a retrospective study, because isn't it data from the past? Right, it's what happened in 1960, 61. What you then might want to do is takes a bit of money, but you might want to delve into the data a little bit more and see if there's anything that the people who got leukemia did that was consistent or common to all of them. And maybe, I'll make this up, maybe people who work in car companies, right? People who repair cars, fix cars, change engines, maybe a lot of them more than, people who work in shops. And then you think, oh, and then you look at the people who work in them and you find out, oh, it seems to be connected to the oil. And so what you've now got is this particular brand or this group of oil is causing leukemia. And then what happens is somebody gets sued, right? And you have a big sue and the people get sued. So the ones that are going out right now is mesothelioma. You know that, heard of that one? Right. The retrospective studies figured out that if you worked through places where there was a lot of asbestos, that was a very strong contributing factor. So people who worked in shipyards where there's a lot of asbestos going on, I don't know what you do with asbestos in shipyards, but evidently there's a lot of it in there. People who worked in the building trade where they used to use asbestos for insulation, a lot of them were getting that type of cancer. And so they put it down to that, and off they go and they do it. What are the ones? You ever heard of a drug called thalidomide? It was a morning sickness drug that women would take, right, when they were pregnant, and they discovered that it was causing birth defects. Right? And
Our friend has a Spokane.
was that caused by that?
Yeah.
Right. So that was it. Right. They did a big class action suit. So I don't know if your friend had nothing to do with me, but if they can prove that that was the medication that she was taking, she would have had a case to go into that. Mesothelioma is one. I think they've got one. I can't remember what it is, but isn't there one that kills weeds? And there's a case that they've done a retrospective study, and there's a lot of people getting cancer for
Glyphosate.
Say that name again, Brandon.
Glyphosate.
And it's not that one, but
It's the Roundup chemical.
Roundup, that is it. Yes,
Yeah,
it's the Roundup.
glyphosate is the chemical.
Oh, is that the thing that's in it? Okay, so that's the one we're talking about. Now, they didn't know that that was causing problems until they did the retrospective studies. So they looked at how come we're getting more of this cancer, and they found out it was people who worked in farms, or people who were, worked in nurseries, or the people who come round and do your yard stuff, that they were getting it a lot more because they were exposed to it like every day, where you and me might only use it, once a season or something. So we would less likely catch it. They're all examples of retrospective studies. They've been done. Normally, you don't do them until you've actually noticed that there's a problem. And if you don't notice a problem, whatever it is that's causing damage is going to continue to cause it.
Meta-analysis fall under retrospective studies because you're doing a review study of previous studies?
Yes, that's just another version of it. Now, prospective studies are ones you're going to do in the future. Right now, there's marijuana is legal, right? If nobody's doing it, they should. Somebody should be right now doing a prospective study. Now, simply that would be get 1,000 volunteers who, or whatever number you can afford, who smoke marijuana regularly, and get another 1,000 like me who never smoked it in their life. And you are going to follow those people for, depends how much time you think it's going to be for marijuana smoking to cause any noticeable effect, right, in health. Maybe 5 years, right? So you follow them for 5 years, and over that 5-year period, you collect data on their mental health, their physical health, suicide rates, whatever you think is important for both groups. And we won't know that until 5 years from now, right? Because they're collecting the data today, right? And they're going to walk it through for 5 years. Prospective study. Now, at the end of that 5 years, you might come up and say, there's no difference between the two groups, right? They're dying at the same rate. They're unhealthy in certain ways, but not one more than the other. Their mental health's equal and so on. And that's fine, in which case I'll be totally proved wrong. Or you might find that people who are taking marijuana are showing higher incidence of mental health issues and suicide rates. There is evidence, not great evidence, but there is some evidence done on retrospective studies where heavy duty marijuana smokers, especially because the active ingredient in marijuana, which has got 3 letters like DHP or CPH or whatever the letter is, I can't remember, right? That thing is much stronger now than it used to be in the 60s when people were smoking marijuana. It was much less strong, for whatever word. And so there is evidence that long-term marijuana smokers are going to have health issues in the future. Now, we don't know it because they're going to do it. Now, I hope to God that they actually are doing a prospective study. I don't want them to wait 5 years and then do a retrospective study because too much damage might be done by then, but that's case control study is basically happening. You could do it today. You would get 2 groups, so it's very close to being a prospective. You get 2 groups and they're volunteers, and one group does something and the other doesn't. So one group watches 8 hours of TV, a day, and the other group just don't have a TV in the house, right? They hardly watch it at all. And you compare them. And the first group, you find out what their average weight is, and the second group, you find out what their average weight is. And I'll make this up. People who watch TV a lot tend to be fatter than people who don't. People who watch TV a lot have more health issues than people who don't, right? And various things like that. So you're getting the data almost instantaneously, right? You just find two groups and you ask them questions, right? Same questions, and you compare them. And if there's a difference, it might well simply be to do with their lifestyle, right? And isn't watching TV 8 hours a day a lifestyle thing? And I'm assuming that if you don't watch it, you might be more of a outdoor, you know, do a lot of walking, running, whatever. Now, problems with observational studies. First one has got a really funny name. It's called a confounding variable. It's one of its names. It has a couple of names that are essentially the same. Let me show you what that is like. And when we do regression analysis, I'll probably do this one again. Vertical axis is life expectancy, right? So what's the average age a person in this country would live for, right? So America, I think it's 81, 83, something like that, right? If you were in Japan, it's more like 85. If you're in some countries like the Sudan, it's like 40, right? So you go bum, 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 bum. And what you have along this axis is the number of televisions per household. So on average, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Now you might say, how can you have 4 TVs? I bet you most of you have got more than one TV now. Now you might not call it a TV because we have to be general. An iPad is like a TV, right? It's got a screen in it, right? That kind of TV, right? So I'm being pretty general, right? A thing that you can watch movies with. So Brandon, you say you've only got 2?
No, I've got 2 monitors right in front of me.
Yeah, I've got 2 in front of me, right? We also have a TV upstairs and a television downstairs, and we've got at least 3 other computers, and that's only for 2 people. So we got a lot, right? So average number. Now you plot them, and this is what you get. And it's a very interesting pattern. Would you agree that the more household TVs there are, the longer the people in that country live? Right? More TVs, they live longer. Fewer TVs, they live less. Now, if you were using this data, you would come to the wrong conclusion. You would say owning TVs make you live longer. Now, we know that's stupid, right? We know that's dumb. Because if that was true, wouldn't the Americans not be sending food to the Sudan? Wouldn't they be sending televisions? Right? I mean, we know that's silly, right? The real reason for this connection is what a confounding variable is. So the confounding variable is the real reason you see the pattern. Right? If you get an idea of what the real reason behind this pattern is.
It's a measure of affluence.
It is. Would you agree that countries that have a lot of TVs per household tend to be rich, and ones that don't have tend to be poor? Yeah. But being a rich country comes with lots of other benefits. If you're a rich country, don't you probably have good housing, relatively speaking? There's always going to be poor people in every situation, but in general, better housing, better health treatment, more food, in other words, enough, probably too much in our case, right? All the good things that make you live long. Now, if you're in a poor country, won't you have very poor housing, right? You might have housing which, you know, in the winter you almost freeze to death, in the summer you're, you know, very unhealthy, right? A lot of dust, a lot of germs, very little chance of good medical treatment, right? You can't afford it anyway, right? Probably not great food, right? all the things that you want to stay alive. Poor inoculation rates, right? Nobody gets inoculated for anything, right? Virtually. And what you're looking then is the confounding variable here is affluence. It's the real reason what you're saying is going on. Now, if you're doing an observational study and all you observed was how many TVs you had and what the thing is, can you see that you could come to the wrong conclusion? It's not always guaranteed that the thing that you measured are the things that are connected directly. Isn't this connected to affluence? And that's the real reason. That is an example of it. The second one to do with observational studies is you have a lot less control. In fact, don't the two groups separate themselves typically? I smoke and you don't. Now, maybe people, I make this up, let's do the marijuana smokers. Maybe people who smoke marijuana are easygoing, you know, life's fun, right? Less stressed, part of their lifestyle, they smoke. And the people who don't smoke are stressed out, always under things, right? Can you imagine that the health studies in both those groups could be quite different? But was it smoking marijuana that caused the health issues? Or were the health issues just reflected by I smoke marijuana or I don't, right? Is drinking too much coffee causing you stress, or do you, because you are so stressed, you drink a lot of coffee? You see, which one is causing? You see the problem. You have no control, right? And that's your problem. And extending the results inappropriately. You do a study on young people and you find out how many calories they eat a day or a week, whatever, and their weight. And you find out that, you know, you get a data and it looks kind of like this, right? It goes up. And you finish looking at 18-year-olds. Well, let's see, 18-year-olds. And you're doing that extension. If you continue that, won't a 90-year-old weigh 400 pounds? Because you're making the assumption that if that was 15 to 18-year-olds and that's 38 and that's 98, that this increase will just continue to go onwards forever, even although the data stop there. An example of things that you could do that would be extending the data inappropriately would be that you looked at, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and you looked at the employment rate, right? The percentage of people who could work who are employed, right? And the data in this country looks a bit like this. And you would say, oh, it's going down the way. And then you make the inappropriate conclusion. Oh, in 20 years from now, nobody will be working in that country. Well, for the first 4 years, that's what your pattern was saying, right? But in reality, isn't the most likely effect that it might be a recession and then it goes back up again, right? But because you're only taking a snapshot of there, you're extending your result to the future, and you're doing it when there's no real reason to be sure that that pattern that you're seeing is going to extend into the future, right? It's very dangerous to do that. Can you imagine, just for a minute, that you looked at the world temperature over thousands of years? And if you looked at the world temperature over thousands of years, in this particular map, wouldn't those be 2 ice ages? And these would be periods of extreme heat. Give an example. Do you know the Sahara Desert used to be a forest? Do you know that we've had, I don't know how many ice ages, but haven't we had an uncountable number of ice ages, right? there was the ice age that Britain was covered in, and when that proceeded, that's when my country finally had people on it. And there have been ice ages before them. There have been ice ages during the dinosaurs. We have ice ages during everybody. Suppose you only collect data in this window here. Then aren't you going to be saying, we're all going to fry to death because the temperature is just going to keep climbing forever, and you're making that prediction? Of course, if you collected data in this window here, won't you tell us that we're all going to freeze to death, right? Because that temperature is going down, it's just going to keep going down, and we'll have another ice age and we'll never recover. Examples of extending your data inappropriately. You don't want to do it. It's downright dangerous. Nobody should do it, but they do it all the time. And I'm getting my little thing out here because I can. I'm older than I think everybody here. I am old enough to remember when we were going to actually enter another ice age. The world's climate was cooling and we were all going to freeze to death. And then the people who told me that didn't tell me personally, but they said, oh, we got it wrong. And now, later on, instead of having an ice age, we were all going to fry to death. Right, the temperature, world temperature, was going to climb, and we're all going to fry to death. And then they told me they got that wrong. And now they tell me it's global, what's it called? Global change, global weather change? What's the title? I've forgotten the title.
Climate change.
Oh, it's called climate change, right? So we're going to have climate change. I think that's a really cool phrase, because you cannot disprove climate change, because isn't that what the weather is? Well, they tell me that it's not, but people who get something wrong twice, I'm not really comfortable with their third prediction. Secondly, these are the same people that can't tell me what the weather's going to be like in 2 weeks from now, but they can tell me what it's going to be like in 20 years from now. And you can tell I'm totally biased. Aidan, tell me your views, because I'm sure they're better.
So climate change as opposed to weather, weather is more on the short term, whereas climate is an expected pattern in a specific region. So if you have an expected pattern, but it's changing at a constant rate, then you have climate change.
Okay, so that's their definition. Okay, I can understand that.
And why it changed from, because it was global cooling and then global warming and then now climate change, why they changed it was because people consistently were like, well, it's the hottest summer on record, so it can't be cooling, or it's the coldest winter on record, so it can't be warming. But those are weather patterns, not climate patterns.
Right.
So to make it easier for people to digest, they tried to change the name.
Okay. Well, I am totally willing to accept that I am wrong. I have been wrong so many times in my life. The only thing that will convince me, of course, is good evidence. And once I see that, I will be in favor of that theory or not. Until that happens, of course, I choose to be a skeptic.
Actually, the hottest day on record as opposed to the hottest summer on record.
Mm-hmm. Was the 90s thing we got a few days ago? No, I think we got 100. Didn't we get 100? I think we got 100.
In Leavenworth.
Oh, that's a nice place. So, finish with observational. Told you today was going to be a little bit different. And here's our last one. Types, it's cool. Always bear in mind that anything I say, because I'm very opinionated, is an opinion, not a fact, right? So I'm totally totally likely to be wrong in almost half the things I say. And the other half the things, if I'm right, it's more by luck. Now, let's look at experiments. We've done a lot of these, but for completeness sake, we'll talk a little bit more about them. An experiment is, or experimental design, if you want a fuller title, is essentially a situation where you have two groups, but you are in control of who goes into each group and what happens to each group. And in the big scheme of things, experiments are much better. The information you get and the conclusions you make are stronger when it's an experiment than if it was an observational study. So you'll have two groups from a little picture. And the first group, as we know, is called your control group. And your second one is called your experimental group. In a normal experiment, what you would do is you'd get maybe 500 people, right? Volunteers, you have to do that. And you randomly assign them to one or other of the groups. So you might put 250 in this group and then 250 in that group. And then you do something different to each group. But because these groups were randomly assigned, won't both these groups be very similar to each other, right? They'll be young and old and healthy and not healthy and all the other things. So they're pretty much the same kind of people in both groups. And the control group depends on what you're doing. The control group might be, let's do a medicine story, that's a classic one. Let's suppose I want to test blood pressure pill, right? So you take this pill and it makes your blood pressure go down. So our group, our 500 people, are people with high blood pressure, right? You would only want to do it with people who needed it, right? And you put them into two groups, and this group gets the old drug, and this group gets the new drug. And then you have some kind of measurement of effectiveness. Maybe if you get your blood pressure below a certain number, that's called a success, right? And so you figure out what the success rate for each group is. And, we do this a lot. Let's suppose that the old drug gets 80 and the new drug gets 85, right? That's the kind of way we would set up. And we've done, haven't we done things like estimate the difference and so on? But we're not going to that. What you've got here then are two groups who, for essentially every other aspect of them, is the same. And the only difference is the drug that they got. Then if there's an improvement in one compared to the other, is it not evidence that the new drug is doing a better job than the old one? And then we do some statistic analysis to see whether or not that difference is actually statistically significant or just coincidence, right? And experiments, because of this method, if we end up at the end of the day saying the new drug is actually doing better than the old drug, great, you can now move on and do some stuff. There are three versions of how this might work. There's no blinding at all. That means that the people in each group know which pill they're getting. And the doctor, typically it's your own doctor that measures it, is measuring your blood pressure, right? So you know what you're getting. Oh, I'm still getting the old drug, fine. Oh, I've got this new drug, okay. And you collect the data. That's the weakest version, because in that case, couldn't the placebo effect actually make a difference? Now, it might not make a huge difference, but couldn't it make enough difference to come out in the results? And the placebo effect is basically, if you think a drug is going to do you some good, like reduce your blood pressure, if you take it and you believe that, couldn't you be a little bit calmer and your blood pressure goes down, right? Hey, this drug's going to make me feel calmer and my blood pressure is going to go down. I'm not as stressed because this new drug is good and it's going to make me, healthier. Now, in a single blind, typically these two people right? These two groups don't know what pill they're getting, right? You're getting the sugar, you're getting the old pill, you're getting the new pill, but both pills look exactly the same, right? They're made to look the same, right? And you can't tell the difference. And in a double blind, the doctor who's measuring you doesn't know as well, right? So that's pretty good data. If you can do a double blind experiment and you get a significant result, you could almost take that to the bank. Just checking the chat here. Okay.
And would you say the 5% increase is a significant result in most situations?
If I did the analysis on that, which would be a hypothesis test, my gut feeling is that that would probably just about make it under, say, a 10%. Right. I'd have to do the number crunching to find out. But if I did get a successful result, right, it would be significant statistically. You could publish a paper and say, use this new drug, doctors, it does a better job, right? And it would be truthful based on the data, at least, to say that. So what is possible? What is the problem with experiments? Why don't we do them all the time? Why do we even need observational? The biggest one is ethical reasons. It's not ethically good to take a group of 500 people, randomly split them into two groups and make one group do something that's bad for them and the other group don't make them do that. So let's see. Suppose I wanted to prove, which we know now, that smoking cigarettes is bad for you. In other words, it has lots of health issues. If I wanted to do an experiment, wouldn't I have to find 500 people, right, random, volunteers, randomly split them into two groups and say to group one, you're the control group. You're not going to do anything. You are not going to smoke a cigarette again. You'd have to be a fascist or a communist country to do that, but you could put things like, if we catch you smoking, it's 20 years in jail, or we'll shoot you, or something really bad. Something so bad that you'll say, okay, I ain't going to smoke. And then this group here, you make them smoke 100 cigarettes a day. Now, can you see you're making people do things that are bad for them to prove that it's bad for them, right? It's not a good thing to do. Ethically, that is a horrible thing to do. But you could do it, couldn't you? If you had a fascist country and you wanted to see if something had an effect. Right? And all you would do is make them smoke, I don't know, for 10 years. How many caught cancer? How many caught cancer? Whoa, 4 times as many people got lung cancer as this group. Smoking is definitely bad. It gives you lung cancer, amongst other things. You'd have great evidence, right? But ethically bad. You do not want to do that. You shouldn't do that. They are very expensive to conduct. You have to have a decent number of people. I'm saying 250. That's a bit on the small side. You should really have about 500. Remember that magic 1,000 thing? It's a kind of the kind of gold standard if you want to do a good one. And the same thing is here. You could extend the results inappropriately, right? You've seen a pattern, and then you say, well, if you smoke 10 cigarettes a day, the chance that you get cancer is 1%, right? If you smoke 100, it's 10 times as much. Well, if you smoke 1,000, you'll be dead by tomorrow. Well, that's probably true, but but you could extend the result, and that may be not the case. Anecdotal evidence. My father smoked a cigarette, pipe, cigar, one of those three, his entire life, made it to 86, and he didn't die of cancer or smoking related disease at all. That is not evidence that smoking doesn't give you cancer, right? That's just my dad and his lifestyle. My uncle, what was his name? My uncle William, actually, my dad's same name. My mum's brother. Very fit guy, never smoked, played football till he was 30 plus, right? Very healthy job. Died of lung cancer. Can you see that there's a problem that even when you've got data, anecdotal data might contradict what you think. Smoking does not give you cancer. Smoking increases your chance of getting cancer. That might sound lawyer-esque, but can't you smoke for 60 years of your life, in my dad's case, 70 years of your life, and still not get cancer? So it's not a guarantee when we say these things. Isn't this a generalization that for most people, it will increase your chance? It doesn't mean you'll get it. And non-smokers, it doesn't mean that you won't get cancer, because can't you get cancer for other reasons unconnected with smoking, right? Can't really do it. To finish, I'll tell you, I don't know if I told you this story, but it's a good example of the ethics of doing experiments. There was, when I was at Glasgow University and I was getting one of my degrees, we had our professor there was telling us about a study on prostate cancer. And the study, this was an experiment that was done, you know, with all the double blind and everything going on. And it was done with people with, I guess I'll call it late stage prostate cancer. But, you know, I think they give them numbers now, don't they? Say like stage 3 or stage 4 or whatever. They give them a number. Right? And they were in like very dangerous stage, right? Late stage prostate cancer. And they had the old treatment, so the control group were getting, you know, the chemotherapy and the pills and whatever they did, and they were under that. And some of them made it, right? Some, you know, that treatment did work for some of them, right? Even at late stage, you can get recovery and remission, and that worked fine. And then they had this new drug that this Danish pharmaceutical company were trying out. And it was a very, very powerful drug. It attacked the cancer really vigorously. But one of the things about drugs and cancer drugs in particular is that they can be potent, almost to the point of being a poison. And so the people that were in this group, after just a few months, the death rate here was phenomenal. Like something ridiculous, like a quarter of them had died within a month. And the pharmaceutical company wanted to keep the thing going. And they'd spent a lot of money in this drug. And their hope was that because this drug was so potent, those people who were really weak, it just killed them, right? Right, their body couldn't handle, you know, the shock of this drug, right? And it killed them. But they were hoping that if it didn't kill them right at the start and they were healthy, relatively healthy enough, the drug would start working on the cancer, and then they'd have, at the end of the day, a bigger success rate. Because make this number, can you imagine only 10% of these people would make it, right, on the old drug system? They were hoping that this would be like 20%, right? So it might kill off the weak ones, but if you could hang in there long enough, the drug would start killing the cancer and you'd survive. So I guess the question is, do you continue to do an experiment when the initial data comes back and tells you it's deadly? And that's an ethical decision, isn't it? Because what they did do is actually, thankfully, they pulled the plug, but they waited another month until like 50% of them had died. And then they said, okay, this isn't working, right? And then they pulled it. But